The slap echoed. Edward staggered. Matt laughed, loud, proud, and wrong. He had no idea the man he just humiliated was the father of the soldier walking through that door. But to understand how we got here, we have to rewind. Just 34 minutes. It was 7:26 a.m. on a Wednesday in Fairgrove, Ohio. Population 3,982. The kind of town where folks still wave at school buses, where flags hang from front porches, and where the local diner, Maple, Maine, serves more coffee than any gas station in a 60-mile radius. Edward Ellis pushed open the heavy glass door at exactly 7:30, like he had every week for the last 4 years. Same booth, same coffee, same quiet dignity. He wore a clean but worn navy cardigan, pressed slacks and polished shoes. A small American flag pin glinted on his collar, positioned perfectly, right beside a purple heart lapel that had long stopped attracting attention. That was the point. Edward didn't need anyone to clap for him. He hadn't walked into that diner as a hero. He just came for black coffee and peace. The place was already half full. Farmers swapping weather predictions, a couple of nurses laughing over early shift stories, and in the far corner, the man everyone pretended not to see, Matt Morrison. Matt was the kind of guy who filled every room he entered, not with presence, but with volume. 30-something, broad-shouldered work boots scuffed from yesterday's drywall job, and a Confederate flag tattoo just barely visible beneath his sleeve. He wasn't just a bully, he was a small-town tyrant. The kind who believed respect meant people not talking back. And Edward? Well, Edward just represented everything Matt couldn't stand. Black, calm, unafraid. Here. Edward didn't even glance at Matt as he passed. He just gave a polite nod to Jenny, the waitress, who already had his coffee brewing without asking. "Morning, Mr. Ellis," she smiled. "Just the toast today." Edward nodded. "And the news, if it's not too depressing." Jenny smirked. "It always is." He slid into his usual booth. Back to the wall, eyes on the exits. A habit from wars nobody asked him to talk about. He reached into his weathered wallet and counted exact change. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, and a nickel. Then his phone buzzed. James. Text message. "Briefing at 0800, thinking of you, stay sharp." Edward smiled to himself. He typed back slowly. "Proud of you, son. Stay safe." Across the room, Matt had noticed. And he didn't like it. Didn't like how the old man walked in like he belonged. Didn't like how people greeted him like he mattered. Matt muttered under his breath, but just loud enough for his buddy to hear. Used to be, people like that knew their place. His friend chuckled uncomfortably. Didn't agree. But also didn't say anything. That was the problem in towns like this. Silence always picked a side. At 7:42 a.m., Matt stood up. He didn't need more coffee. He just needed to make a point. He walked across the diner, boots heavy on tile, mouth full of venom wrapped in a smirk. He stopped at Edward's booth and leaned in. "Don't see too many of your kind this early." Edward looked up calmly. "Just here for coffee." Matt smiled. "Yeah? Well, maybe next time pick a town that fits you better." Jenny saw it. So did Chief Romero sitting near the window. But nobody said a word. Edward adjusted his cup. Didn't rise. Didn't react. Matt tilted his head, looking for the reaction he wasn't getting. "What's the matter, old man? Too good to speak to me?" Edward locked eyes with him. "No. I just know better than to waste words on noise." And that was when Matt's smile disappeared. It was 7:47 a.m., and it happened fast. Matt slapped him. The sound was loud, open palm, full force. It cracked across the diner like a dropped plate. Coffee jolted. Forks stopped moving. Edward staggered back, shocked. The pain was sharp, but what burned more was the humiliation. Not just the slap, but the fact that no one moved. Not the waitress, not the fire chief. Not the other men who had nodded hello just 20 minutes earlier. Matt stood over him, laughing, loud, proud, and wrong. He didn't know the soldier walking through that door, the one in the dark coat and no-nonsense stride, wasn't here for breakfast. He was here for his father. Edward didn't speak. His fingers hovered just above the table, trembling slightly, more from humiliation than pain. The diner had gone dead quiet. No plates clinking, no chairs squeaking, only the soft hum of the ceiling fan, spinning like nothing happened. Matt stood tall, chest puffed out, like he'd won something. His lips curled into a satisfied sneer. "Didn't think you'd be so easy to shut up." Jenny's hand went to her mouth, but the rest of her froze. Chief Romero's knuckles whitened, but he stayed seated. Too much badge. Not enough spine. And Matt. He loved it. He turned to the room like he was on stage. "Y'all saw him, right? Acting like he runs this place." Edward straightened his back slowly. One hand moved to his cheek, where the skin was already swelling. His other hand reached carefully for his phone on the table, not to call anyone, not yet, just to feel it, to remind himself. He wasn't alone. Then the door opened. The little bell above the frame jingled, just once, soft, innocent. But everything shifted. In walked a man in a black peacoat, shaved close, broad shoulders, eyes that didn't flinch. He scanned the room like he'd been trained to spot danger in seconds. Because he had. James Ellis was used to chaos. He'd seen it in Kandahar, Seoul, and inside the Pentagon's war rooms, but he'd never expected to find it in a small-town diner, wrapped around the man who raised him. He didn't say anything at first. His boots stopped 2 steps inside. His eyes landed on Edward, then the red imprint on his face, then Matt. Then, "Dad?" Matt turned, still riding the high, still unaware that the world had just changed. "Oh, great. The family reunion." James took a step forward, not fast, not loud, just precise, like he wasn't approaching a man, he was closing in on a target. "What happened?" His voice was calm. Too calm. Edward opened his mouth but said nothing. Not yet. Matt, still unaware, rolled his eyes and waved his hand. "What happened is your daddy here was mouthing off." "So you hit him?" James didn't blink. Matt scoffed. "Man, calm down. He's fine. It's just a little—" "You laid hands on my father?" Still no blinking, still no emotion. Just the words. Sharp, measured, lethal. Matt laughed. "Big mistake. Look, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but around here, we don't let just anyone act like they own the place. That man needs to learn some respect." The diner still hadn't moved. Half the crowd was frozen in place. The other half had their phones out, recording every second. Someone whispered, "That's James Ellis, Commander James Ellis, U.S. Military Intelligence." Someone else, "You're kidding." No one was kidding. James stepped closer. "What's your name?" Matt folded his arms. "Why? You gonna report me?" "No." James tucked his coat behind his holster, revealing a glint of metal. "I'm going to document what happens next." Edward finally spoke. Low, controlled. "James, don't." But James didn't turn. His eyes stayed on Matt. "Did you strike this man?" Matt shrugged. "Witnesses saw what they saw." "That's not an answer." "You military types always think you're better than us," Matt spit. "Just 'cause you wear a badge and fly around the world don't mean nothing here." James smiled, not out of humor, out of restraint. "You're right. I don't matter here. But the badge that comes after me does." Then James raised his phone, tapped a number, put it on speaker. 1 ring, 2, click. "Commander Ellis, go ahead." A female voice, crisp, federal. James didn't look away from Matt. "Activate local incident protocol. Civilian assault, elderly veteran, federal contact. Send the file to DHS, DOJ, and VA command." "Understood. Facial ID and location pinged. Backup ETA, 17 minutes. Matt's smile dropped. The entire diner watched him shrink in real time. If you saw someone slap a quiet, elderly man like that, would you have stood up or stayed silent like the rest of this room? Let me know in the comments. I really want to know who you would have been in that moment. Matt's voice cracked. "You're bluffing." James took a slow breath. "You just assaulted a Purple Heart recipient, and you did it on video, in front of half the town, while his son was walking through that door. You think you're still the one in control. And if this moment hit something deep in you, even a little, Don't just scroll past. Hit that subscribe button, because stories like this don't just entertain, they reveal who we are when no one's watching. Matt backed up half a step, then another, but it was already too late. Every eye in the diner was on him, every camera, every whisper. And James, he wasn't finished, not even close. Matt was sweating now, not from heat, but from something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. He looked around the diner and realized he wasn't the one holding the room anymore. People who used to nod at him looked away. People who used to laugh at his jokes now held their phones like shields. Even Chief Romero wouldn't make eye contact. And James. James was standing so still it made Matt twitch. "I didn't mean nothing by it," Matt muttered, backing up toward his table. "It was a misunderstanding." Jenny raised an eyebrow from behind the counter. "Misunderstanding doesn't usually leave a handprint on someone's face," Matt snapped. "You stay out of this. It's none of your business." But his voice cracked, and that crack was louder than anything else in the room. James took one step closer, but Edward held up a hand. "Let it go, son." James didn't move. "Dad, he put his hands on you. In public. You think I'm walking away from that?" Edward's voice was low, measured, but tired. "I've had worse. From men in better suits." The air between them thickened. This wasn't just about a slap. This was about every silent insult, every forced smile, every time Edward had to swallow his pride to survive. James knew that look. It was the same look he saw in war zones, the face of a man who had seen too much and still chose silence over escalation. Chief Romero finally stood. He cleared his throat, but his voice was soft, uncertain. "Look, maybe we all need to take a breath here. This town doesn't need another headline." James turned to him slowly. "A black veteran gets assaulted in your diner, and your first concern is the headline." Romero blinked, didn't answer, didn't have to. Edward pushed back his chair, stood slowly, still steady, still silent. He looked around the diner at all the people pretending they didn't see it happen, at the ones recording it but not saying a damn thing. Then he looked at his son. "Let's go." James hesitated. "Dad, let's go." They walked out together. The bell jingled again, the same way it had when Edward walked in, only this time the sound felt colder. Outside the sun was already climbing. Birds chirped like nothing had happened. Edward took a deep breath, but it didn't settle his chest. James walked beside him, silent, until they reached the truck. Edward turned. "This isn't your fight." James didn't answer at first. Then, "It became mine the second he touched you." But Edward wasn't convinced. "Press charges and they'll paint me as the problem. A bitter old man, a thug in a cardigan. You know how this works." James shook his head. "Not this time." But Edward looked past him. "Every time they say that. Not this time, not again, not here. And yet, here we are." Back inside the diner, Matt slumped in his booth. His buddy had left without a word. The waitress wouldn't come refill his cup. His hands were shaking, but not from anger, from realization. He pulled out his phone, started typing, a lawyer's number, maybe a contact at the local news station. He'd spin it. He always spun it. The old man was threatening me. I was defending myself. It had worked before. He just had to move fast. But this time, as he typed, a video alert popped up. His face, frozen mid-slap, posted by someone named Jenny Speaks. Caption, "This is how Fairgrove treats its veterans." Already 11,000 views, and rising. Matt's mouth went dry. Outside, Edward sat in the truck, silent. James watched him, saw the tightness in his jaw, the storm behind his eyes. But Edward didn't speak. He just stared straight ahead. At nothing. At everything. James looked down at his phone. The agency had already flagged the video. Internal alert systems pinging. Media inquiries incoming. This wasn't just going to be town gossip. This was about to go national. But in that moment, it didn't feel like a victory. James glanced over at his father. a man who'd survived combat, racism, and decades of silence, now sitting there, quietly humiliated in the town he'd tried to belong to. James wanted to scream. But Edward? He just muttered, "They never hit you for who you are, James. They hit you for what they think you're not." And James realized this wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity, and the line between the two was razor thin. Edward didn't say a word the entire drive. James didn't push him. The silence between them was thick, not empty but full, loaded with things they'd never said, years of distance disguised as mutual respect. They ended up at the Maple Inn, a modest roadside motel on the edge of Fairgrove. No fancy rooms, just faded brick, humming soda machines, and keys that still jingled. James paid for 2 nights. Inside the room, Edward took the single chair by the window. James stood for a while, then dropped his duffel bag on the bed. Neither man said it out loud, but both knew why they weren't driving back to Columbus right now. There were too many eyes on them, too much noise online, too many calls from federal departments telling James to stand by and not escalate further. This wasn't over, not even close. Edward turned on the small TV, muted it immediately, just wanted the light, not the noise. James sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees. Finally, "You know this won't go away on its own." Edward didn't look at him. Does it ever? James took out his phone, scrolled through a flood of notifications. The video had crossed 80,000 views. Major accounts were reposting it. Veteran groups, civil rights activists, even a couple news anchors had tagged it with words like disgrace, small-town shame, modern-day sundown towns. James looked up. "Dad, you shouldn't have to sit with this." Edward exhaled slowly. "What makes you think this is the first time?" James blinked, didn't know what to say. Edward finally looked at him. "You think I never had a man put his hands on me and call me boy? Not in the 60s, not in the army, not in this very town." James clenched his jaw. "That doesn't make it okay." "No, but it made me survive." There was no argument in Edward's tone, just history, raw, heavy, unmovable. James stood and walked to the window. Outside, a group of locals stood by a pickup truck, talking, watching. One of them pointed toward the motel. James pulled the curtain shut. "Some of them are already picking sides." Edward didn't react. "They always do. Doesn't matter if they've shaken your hand every Sunday. They pick comfort over courage." There was a knock at the door. Both men tensed. James stepped forward and opened it cautiously. Jenny, still in her apron, eyes tired, voice low. "I brought you something." She handed James a brown envelope. Inside, a USB stick. "It's the full security footage from the diner. Manager was too afraid to turn it over." "I wasn't." James looked at her. "Why?" Jenny shrugged. "Because that man sat at that booth for years, never bothered a soul. And that other man? He's made a career out of bothering everybody." She looked past James at Edward. "Tell him, we're not all like Matt." Edward nodded once. No words. She left quietly. James sat back down, slid the USB into his laptop. No sound, just silent footage. But the image was clear. Matt standing over Edward, the shove, the slap, the laughter. James watched it in full, twice. Edward didn't watch it at all, just stared out the window. Finally, "You ever wonder why I never showed up to your promotions?" James turned slowly, caught off guard. "I figured you were busy, or didn't want the attention." Edward shook his head. "I didn't go because I didn't want to see you praised by a system that never saw me." That landed like a gut punch. James sat back, stunned, silent. "You're everything I wanted you to be," Edward continued, "but I never knew if you'd understand what it cost me to let you become it." James swallowed hard. "I understand now." But Edward didn't answer, just turned back toward the window as a black SUV rolled past the motel, federal plates. They were being watched too. James stood again. This town's about to feel pressure like it's never felt before. Edward's voice came back, low. Pressure doesn't change people, it just shows who they already were. The room went quiet again. James sat. Edward stared. Outside the sky dimmed, but inside the weight between them only got heavier. No arrests had been made, no statements taken, no apology offered, just two men in a motel room, trapped in a waiting game neither of them ever asked to play. James sat in the motel room, laptop open, fingers still hovering over the keyboard. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. The video from the diner played on loop. Each time the moment landed harder. The slap, the stumble, the humiliation. But it wasn't the violence that wrecked him. It was how quietly his father took it. Like it was
Edward
just
sat in
another
the chair
Tuesday by the window, back straight, arms crossed, looking out like he was guarding something. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. James finally broke the silence. "You didn't even flinch." Edward didn't turn. Wasn't the first time. That made James's stomach turn. "You mean someone's hit you like that before, since the war?" Edward turned slowly now. His voice wasn't angry. It was something deeper. Disappointment. "James, I came back from Vietnam in '72, a black man, in uniform, decorated, and I was told to leave a restaurant for disrespecting the flag because I asked for service." James looked down. His father wasn't telling a story. He was revealing a scar. Edward continued. "I buried 3 friends in one night, watched a man die in my arms, held another while he begged me to tell his mama he tried. His voice cracked, just barely. And when I came home, I got spat on in my uniform. My medal didn't matter. My service didn't matter." James sat back. He'd read about this in history books, but history had never been this close, never this personal. Edward looked away again. "So when Matt slapped me, that wasn't the shock." He paused. "The shock was that it still happens and nobody moves." A knock came at the door. Not the police, not a reporter. It was Mrs. Jordan, an older white woman who owned the town's flower shop. Her hands were shaking. "I'm sorry to bother you, I saw the video and I wanted to say something." She stepped in awkwardly. "When my husband got drafted, your father was his sergeant. Said he wouldn't have made it back without him." She held up a faded photo. Edward and a young soldier, arm in arm. "That's him, and that's you." Edward stared at the picture. He didn't remember the boy's name, but he remembered the mission. Mrs. Jordan placed a small box on the table. Inside, a bronze star. "He left it behind when he passed. Said it always belonged to you anyway." She bowed her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ellis. I'm sorry for all of it." When she left, Edward stayed frozen. James opened the box, touched the medal gently. "You saved that man's life, and you still got slapped like a criminal." Edward exhaled. "Son, being a hero won't save you from hatred. It just makes you more visible to the people who carry it." James was silent. Then he stood, walked to his duffel and pulled something out. A framed photo, his promotion ceremony, 3 stars on his collar, saluting the flag. But next to him in the frame, an empty chair. He handed the photo to Edward. "I saved this seat for you every time." Edward's face didn't change, but his grip on the armrest tightened. James sat across from him now, not as a soldier, but as a son. "Why didn't you come?" Edward stared at the photo. "Because I didn't want to stand in a room full of generals and pretend like they saw me." "They would have, Dad." Edward met his gaze. "You would have. They wouldn't." Silence. Heavy. Raw. Real. 2 generations of men. Both soldiers, both proud, both carrying wounds they never asked for. At this point in the story, do you blame Edward for staying silent all these years? Or do you understand why he chose survival over speaking up? I'd really love to hear your take in the comments, and if this part of the story hit something real in you, if it made you feel something you've buried too long, don't just watch and scroll. Subscribe. Because stories like this aren't just told to be heard, they're told to be remembered. Outside, a car door slammed. Voices, movement. James stood, pulled the curtain back, a news van, then another. The motel parking lot was filling up. Edward looked at him. "You still think we're in control of this thing?" James didn't answer because he didn't know anymore. Inside that motel room sat a father carrying 72 years of silent sacrifice, and a son who finally understood what his father had carried for him. But outside, the world was watching, judging, and choosing sides. The night fell quietly over Fairgrove. Inside the motel room, the hum of the air conditioner was the only sound for several long minutes, until James finally broke it. "You still drink your coffee black?" Edward smirked, didn't look up from the newspaper he wasn't really reading. "Was there ever another way?" James chuckled. "The base serves sludge. You'd hate it. If it doesn't put hair on your chest, it ain't coffee." They both laughed, and for the first time in years, it wasn't awkward, it wasn't forced, it was honest. James stood, stretched, and walked to the small kitchenette in the corner. He pulled 2 chipped mugs from the cabinet and started the tiny drip machine. "You know," he said over the sputter of brewing, "when I was 12, you told me never to hit a man unless I meant it." Edward looked up now. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you said that year." James turned, leaned against the counter. "You were home for 6 months straight, the longest you'd ever stayed." Edward nodded slowly. "That was after Afghanistan." "You never talked about it." "Some things are easier to carry in silence." James poured the coffee, handed a mug to Edward. They sat in their old positions, father by the window, son on the bed, but the air felt different, lighter. Edward took a slow sip. "Still tastes like burnt rubber." "Tradition," James grinned. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. Outside, the motel sign buzzed softly in the distance. Inside, a storm was easing, just enough to breathe. Edward turned to his son. "You ever wonder what your mother would say about all this?" James paused. "Every day." Edward's eyes softened. "She would have hated the cameras, but she would have sat front row at your hearings. She hated suits, still would have come." They both smiled. James reached into his duffel again. This time he pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, opened it. Inside, a necklace, dog tags. He walked over and placed them in Edward's hand. "These are yours." Edward stared at them. "From the unit?" James nodded. "From the mission you never talked about?" Edward looked up, surprised. James sat back down. "I found the debrief report 5 years ago. I know what you did out there." Edward's fingers closed around the tags slowly. "They told us never to speak of it." "I know, but I needed to." He looked up. "Because I needed to understand where my spine came from." That hit Edward hard. His lips tightened. His eyes glistened. Just for a second, he looked away. "You didn't get it from me, James. You were born with it." "Maybe, but you taught me how to use it." For a while they just sat. 2 generations, 2 soldiers, 2 men who had only known love through protection, now finally learning it through presence. James eventually leaned back, head against the wall. "You ever think you'll leave this town?" Edward looked out the window. "I've buried too much of myself here to start over now." "You don't owe this place anything," Edward smirked. "Maybe not, but I owe it to the version of me that thought this town could change." Just then, a knock at the door. James stood up cautiously, checked the peephole. Maria, the woman who ran the local diner's kitchen. She held a small box and a handwritten note. "Didn't feel right," she said, handing it over. "It's his breakfast, on the house." Edward opened the box. Wheat toast, no butter, cut diagonally. Exactly how he ordered it. James looked at Maria. "Thank you." "You don't owe me that," she shook her head. "We all saw what happened. Some of us just waited too long to say it." When she left, Edward took a bite of the toast. Chewed slowly. "Tastes different when it's free." "How?" James asked. Edward looked down at the toast. "Like something I didn't have to earn." The room went still again. And for just a moment, A small moment. There was peace. Not victory, not resolution, just peace. But outside the motel window, a group of men had gathered. Matt among them, sunglasses on, arms crossed, phones in hand, and a local camera crew setting up nearby. James pulled the curtain halfway shut. "What now?" Edward folded the last corner of his toast back into the box. "Now we find out how much silence they can handle when it isn't ours." The next morning, the motel room television flickered to life. Not because Edward turned it on, but because James did, remote clenched in his hand like a weapon. He wasn't looking for news, he was looking for betrayal, and he found it. Matt Morrison's face filled the screen, hair slicked back, wearing a navy blazer that didn't fit his usual construction site image. He sat on a couch across from a local anchor, his voice calm, practiced, rehearsed. "It was a misunderstanding," Matt said into the camera. "I never meant to cause any harm. I was defending myself from a perceived threat." The anchor nodded, sympathetic. "And what about the military background of Mr. Ellis?" Matt leaned forward, placing a hand over his heart. "Look, I have respect for our veterans, but I didn't know who he was. He was acting aggressive, loud. I got scared. That's all it was." James stood from the bed like something just burned him. "Loud?" Edward didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at the screen, at the lie unfolding in real time. James paced the room. "He just rewrote the whole damn thing and they're letting him." He grabbed his phone, opened the video. It had over 3 million views now, but so did Matt's interview. Hashtags were popping up. Protect small towns, or veteran or victim. He was aggressive. The comments made James sick. Why didn't the old man just leave? Betty mouthed off first. "The military doesn't make you immune to consequences." Edward finally spoke, soft, detached. "They're not defending him. They're defending the world they want to believe in." James looked at him. "Then maybe we burn that world down." Edward turned. "No, that's not what I raised you to do. You raised me to fight for what's right, not to destroy what we're trying to fix." Just then, a knock at the door. James froze. This wasn't the soft knock of a waitress or an ally. It was harder, colder. He opened the door. Sheriff Danvers, flanked by 2 deputies. Not a greeting, no smile, just business. "Mr. Ellis, I'm going to need you and your father to come down to the station." James blinked. "For what?" "Statement review. Some new footage has surfaced. We've got claims of mutual aggression. Mayor wants this handled before the weekend." Edward stepped forward. "I didn't lay a hand on that man." Danvers sighed. "That's not how some people are telling it." James narrowed his eyes. "Are we under arrest?" "Not at the moment." Edward grabbed his coat. James didn't stop him. But something in his chest cracked. This town wasn't just trying to protect Matt. It was trying to erase what happened. At the station, they sat in separate rooms. Edward's was cold, windowless. A deputy offered him water. He didn't take it. They played the video, but only pieces of it, just the moment where Edward stood. When he pushed his chair back, they paused the clip right before the slap. "Some are saying you rose up first." Edward didn't respond. "You sure you didn't say something that made Matt feel unsafe?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "Did he say what color I was when I made him feel unsafe?" Meanwhile, across the hall, James wasn't answering questions. He was texting attorneys, calling contacts in DC, filing formal complaints. But even then, even with his rank, he could feel the weight of small-town systems protecting their own. They were released 2 hours later. No charges, no apology, just paperwork and silence. James slammed the car door when they got back in the truck. "They're trying to bury this." Edward nodded. "They always do. You know how many things I've watched get buried?" James punched the dashboard. "Then why the hell do you keep letting it happen?" Edward turned to him sharply. "Because I've survived long enough to know that fire doesn't always fix the foundation. Sometimes it just burns down the only roof we've got." Silence again, but this time it hurt, because in that moment both men were right, and both were alone. They got back to the motel to find a notice slipped under the door, from the manager. "Please vacate the room by noon tomorrow. We're getting too much attention, sorry for the inconvenience." James dropped the paper on the bed. "They're evicting us for being victims." Edward sat down slowly. "No, they're evicting us for refusing to disappear." Outside, Matt stood across the lot, sunglasses on, phone in hand, smiling again. James saw him, felt the heat in his chest rise. He opened the door, started to step out. Edward grabbed his arm. "Don't. He deserves—" "I know what he deserves." Edward's voice cracked, but not from weakness, from the weight of restraint. "But I'm not giving him another second of my soul." James closed the door, stood in the middle of the room, shaking, helpless. And that's when it hit him. Even after all the medals, all the rank, all the power, he still couldn't protect the one person he loved most. What would you do if the system that promised you justice turned around and tried to bury your truth? Would you walk away or fight louder? Tell me below. I want to know who's still willing to stand up. And if your heart is breaking even a little right now, if you feel the frustration, the silence, the injustice, don't just watch, subscribe. Because silence is how they win. And stories like this keep the truth alive. James sat down on the edge of the bed. Edward looked at him, softly, quietly. "It's not over, son." James looked back. "Feels like it is." But outside, just beyond the door, a journalist was dialing her editor. And the story? It had just found a bigger stage. It rained that night. Not a storm, not a downpour. Just that soft, steady kind of rain that seeps into everything and makes silence feel louder. Inside the truck, parked at the edge of an empty highway rest stop, James sat in the driver's seat, engine off, window cracked. Edward was asleep in the passenger seat. But James couldn't rest, not with what the sheriff said, not with what Matt said, not with the eviction notice, not with the cameras, not with that look in his father's eyes, like he was preparing to give up. James had spent his whole life becoming a man who could protect people, but tonight, he couldn't protect anyone from anything. He opened his phone, scrolled through dozens of articles, some defending Matt, others tearing into Edward. His fingers hovered over one article headline, "Vet accused of provoking altercation." He couldn't even bring himself to open it. He clicked over to his contacts, scrolled until he reached a name he hadn't tapped in months. Darla, the woman he almost married. Back when being a soldier felt like enough, before life pulled them apart, he stared at her name, then locked the screen. Wrong time, wrong reason. This wasn't about him. Suddenly, Edward stirred beside him. "You hungry?" James turned. "It's 2 a.m. Edward shrugged. "Could still eat." James chuckled, started the engine. They found an old gas station diner off the highway. Half the lights were out. The only other patron was a trucker asleep in his booth. The waitress didn't ask for names, just nodded when Edward said, "Coffee black." James ordered the same. They sat in silence at the back booth, steam rising from their mugs. Then finally James asked, "Why didn't you fight back?" Edward took a slow sip before answering, "Because there's a difference between justice and satisfaction." James looked confused. That slap, that moment. You could have shut him down right there. Edward nodded. "And what would that have given me? 10 seconds of power? And then the same shame, when they paint me as the threat." James leaned forward. "But you weren't the threat." Didn't matter. To them, I wasn't a man. I was a moment, a headline, a narrative they could shape. James let that sink in, then finally said, "I can't fix this town." Edward nodded. "Neither can I." "Then what do we do?" Edward looked at him. "We tell the truth, and we let the country decide." James pulled out his phone again. This time he didn't hesitate. He opened the email app, typed one name in the subject line, Anderson, CBS. 3 years ago, that same reporter had covered James's unit in Syria. She owed him a favor. He attached the full footage. Security camera, Maria's angle, Tommy's clips, audio, still frames. He hit send, then stared at the screen. Edward watched him. You sure about this? James looked up. No, but I'm tired of being sure and still feeling powerless. They walked out of the diner an hour later, rain still falling, softer now. Edward paused beside the truck, looked at his son. You've always been good at carrying weight, James smiled weakly. Must have learned it from someone. Back at the motel, they found their belongings already packed, stacked outside room 14. No note, no refund, just closure in the form of rejection. James loaded the bag silently, then paused, looked up at the security camera mounted above the door. The red light was on. Good, he whispered. Let them watch. They slept in the truck that night, side by side, like the first road trip James ever took as a teenager, when Edward had driven him through 3 states just to visit a military museum. Back when they barely spoke, back when every mile was an effort. But this time, no effort. Just 2 men sharing space under the weight of a country, still deciding what kind of men they were allowed to be. At 7:42 a.m., James's phone buzzed, not once, not twice, but a dozen times in 10 seconds. Emails, news alerts, mentions. He unlocked it. And there CBS, at the top of his inbox, we're running the story. Noon slot, it'll hit hard. James stared at the message, then looked at Edward, who hadn't said a word, but was already smiling. By noon, the world had changed. Not all of it, not enough of it, but enough to matter, enough to finally be seen. The CBS midday segment began like any other, soft jazz intro, anchor smiling politely into the camera. This next story may disturb some viewers. Cut to the diner footage, no narration, just raw audio, the slap, the stagger, the silence. Then James's voice. Calm, but lethal. You just laid hands on the wrong man. The screen faded to black. Then came the interviews, Maria's trembling voice, Tommy's shaky camera angles, Sheriff Danvers awkwardly backpedaling. Matt's spin fell apart in 30 seconds flat. The public saw it for what it was. A coward attacking someone he thought was powerless. By 3 p.m., Edward's name was trending, not as a victim, but as a veteran, a father, a man. James and Edward sat on a park bench in D.C. that evening, just a few blocks from the Capitol. They weren't hiding anymore. No more motels, no more back exits, no more whispers. James scrolled through his phone, read the headlines aloud. Retired Army vet assaulted in hate crime. Town turns a blind eye. Military commander's father slapped in viral diner attack. Justice slow to move, but it moved. Edward sipped his coffee. Think they'll remember next week? James looked up. Does it matter? Edward considered that, then shook his head. No. What matters is, they remembered today. By sunset, the mayor had issued a formal apology. The sheriff resigned under pressure. Matt's employer publicly fired him. But the real moment came when a line of veterans began arriving in Millbrook, on their own. They showed up at the diner, sat in booths, ordered black coffee, left $100 tips with notes that read, "For Edward. We serve together, always." Maria live-streamed it all. By midnight, her followers had tripled. And for the first time since the slap, she smiled without fear. Across the country, Edward's story sparked a chain reaction. Other elders stepped forward. Other towns got uncomfortable, not because of rage, but because of reckoning. But James, he stayed quiet through most of it. Until one quiet Thursday morning he got a call. Congressional Oversight Committee. They wanted him and Edward to testify, to speak about racism, justice, and silence in public systems. Edward laughed when James told him. Me? They want an old man in a cardigan to talk to suits in D.C.? James smirked. You faced more dangerous men than them, Dad. Edward looked down, then said, Yeah, but back then I didn't know the cameras were rolling. 2 weeks later, they stood in front of a row of senators, cameras flashing. Edward adjusted his flag pin, looked straight ahead. My name is Edward Ellis. I served this country for 30 years. I don't want pity. I want people to stop pretending racism ended just because we stopped saying it out loud. The room fell silent. because truth, when spoken simply, doesn't need decoration. That night, back in their hotel, James poured 2 glasses of bourbon, handed one to his father. "To truth," Edward clinked his glass, "and to never staying silent again." They drank. No cheers, no fanfare, just 2 men finally equal in voice and in peace. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, Matt sat alone, jobless, friendless, his version of the story. Dead on arrival. No interview requests, no followers, no sympathy, just the echo of a slap and the man he should have never touched. Do you believe true strength is shown through silence or action? And when dignity is taken from someone you love, how far would you go to get it back? Tell me in the comments. This one matters. If you've made it this far, don't just walk away. Stories like Edward's deserve more than views. They deserve to be remembered. Hit that subscribe button. Help keep voices like his echoing across every corner they tried to silence. Edward never returned to that diner, not out of fear, out of peace, because when your truth has been heard by millions, when your dignity has been restored, you don't need a booth to feel seen. You just need your name back, and Edward Ellis, he had it. He had.